Chapter 10, we're going to be looking at muscle physiology. And so we'll begin with section 1 on just an overview of the muscular system, including some of the major functions, such as movement, of course, movement of the body, maintenance of posture, respiration, muscles that allow you to breathe, exhale, and inhale, production of body heat, communication. You need muscles to move the body for communication, for using muscles in the mouth for communication, constriction of organs and vessels. That's a special type of muscle called smooth muscle, which we'll look at. Contraction of the heart, again, another special type of muscle, that's cardiac muscle. And then we have some properties of muscle. Muscle tissue has some main properties, and this is a little review back from chapter 4, but there's several main properties that you'll find in all muscle tissue. One is it's contractility. That just means it has the ability to shorten with a measurable amount of force. And then number 2 is excitability. That means that muscle cells have the ability to respond to some kind of stimulus, and usually that stimulus is coming from a neuron, from the nerve. Muscle cells are also extensible, extensibility. That just means that they stretch. They can stretch to their normal length and then actually stretch a little beyond that as well. And they're also elastic. Not only do they stretch, they have the ability to recoil, and that just means that they return back to their resting length after they are stretched. So all 4 of these are properties of muscle cells. And so let's kind of review some of the main distinctions of the 3 types of muscle tissue, 3 types of muscle tissue and cells. Skeletal, that's the main one that we're going to be looking at for a lot of this chapter. It's there for movement of the body because it connects to the bones, and so movement is one of its primary functions here. It is under voluntary control, so you can voluntarily control your skeletal muscles, and it is striated. It does have an alternating light and dark appearance, and that's because of the arrangement of the protein fibers, and we'll look at those a little bit later in this chapter as well. And it represents about 40% of your overall body's weight. You also have another type called smooth muscle. You generally find smooth muscle in the walls of some of the organs, hollow organs, including like the stomach and the intestines and your blood vessels, and even your eye has some smooth muscle associated with it, and your glands and even the skin. In some areas, it is autorhythmic, especially around the intestinal area and the digestive tract area, and it's generally involuntary. It is under control. It's just not under a conscious control. It's more of a subconscious type control mechanism. And so you have other systems, including your endocrine system and your autonomic nervous system, that is kind of regulating what your smooth muscles are doing. Then the last type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle. And of course, this is only found in the heart. It is autorhythmic. That just means it regulates itself. It regulates its own action potentials and rhythm. And it, of course, is involuntary. Now, in section 2, we'll talk a little bit about the structure of muscle fibers. And mainly our goal right now is to look at skeletal muscle cells. And also, we need to start talking about the function. How does the muscle cell, or muscle fiber, as it's called here, how does it function? How does it work to create a contraction? Well, first of all, muscle tissue is made out of muscle cells. Again, those cells are called fibers because they're very, very long type of cells. They're not just a small cell like you would think of, like a skin cell or some type of organ cell. These are relatively long, elongated cells. You can see a picture of one in figure 10.3. Very long cell, so that's usually called a fiber. It does have connective tissue wrapped around it. It usually has access to blood vessels and to nerves. And then usually the skeletal muscle fibers are relatively long and cylindrical. They're also multinucleated. That just means they have more than one nucleus, and you don't usually find that in most of your body cells, but you do find that here. They're multinucleated. And again, we've already mentioned that they do have striations. Now, if you think about different layers of muscle in general, there's actually 4 main layers of connective tissue that you'll find in the structure of muscle. And so around the outermost portion of the muscle is a connective tissue called muscular fascia. It's surrounding the entire muscle area. And so it's like a layer of connective tissue on the outside of a muscle. You have something called the epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. And so if you look at this diagram, they've kind of broken down the muscle tissue and the muscle fibers. And so one of these little bundles here, you can see where it's labeled a muscle fiber. This is a muscle cell, like we looked at on the last slide. That's a muscle cell. Well, it's connected with other muscle fibers all in this little bundle here. And this bundle is what's called a fasciculus. The whole thing is one fasciculus, and so an entire muscle would have many different fasciculi that make up that particular muscle. Well, the connective tissue that you find is going to be kind of wrapped all around these muscle fibers, and so you have a layer of connective tissue inside of this bundle called the endomysium, and it's surrounding the individual muscle fibers or cells. Then you have a layer that's wrapping around, kind of a circular area here, wrapping around that that bundle or that fasciculus, and that's the perimysium. Peri means perimeter, and so this is the perimysium. And then you have the epimysium. This is towards the outside, and so this is surrounding the connective tissue that's kind of surrounding the entire portion here of the muscle. And then again, you got the fascia on the outermost part. The other thing that you find associated with muscles are the neurons and blood supply, blood vessels. And so you've got to have neurons there, and that stimulates your muscle fibers to contract. And then you're also going to have blood supply to this area as well. And usually muscles are very rich in capillaries, the very smallest blood vessels that are there for exchange. And so that allows plenty of oxygen to get to your muscles and nutrients. So again, just a few more terms associated with skeletal muscle cells or fibers. The fiber, again, that's just the name of the cell. They do change the names of some of the parts. For example, the sarcolemma is just another name for the plasma membrane. So the membrane around a muscle cell is called a sarcolemma. The sarcoplasm is just another name for the cytoplasm inside of a muscle cell. We already mentioned they're multinucleate, very long cells. They come from precursor cells called myoblasts. By the way, if you see this prefix myo, it's referring to muscles, and a blast means it's building up a cell, and so a myoblast is kind of a starting type cell that will turn into a muscle or muscle fiber cell. And they're made out of many different types of protein, or several different types of proteins. We'll talk about two of the main ones that we'll look at are actin and myosin. Now, another term that you need to know that's a main part of a muscle is the sarcomere. The sarcomere is the basic functional unit of a muscle fiber. It includes everything that a muscle fiber would need in order to go through its function, which is contraction. And so in this image, and we're going to kind of break it down in some of the pictures, but in this image, the sarcomere goes from one band to the next band. And so just this very small area here is considered to be one sarcomere. Inside of that, you would have all these different proteins that are needed to go through contraction for that muscle. So let's look at some of the main protein fibers that are needed that are part of this sarcomere for the functioning of a muscle fiber. So one type of protein that you have is something called actin. This is a myofilament, a muscle filament. It's a relatively thin type filament, and so it's also relatively fibrous. And so here in this diagram, what they've done is they've taken that muscle cell. This would be a muscle cell, and then inside of here you would have many different myofilaments, and you'd have some that are actin, some that are myosin, two main types of myofilaments that you have. And in the diagram here, they've shown you one sarcomere. And again, it goes from one band to the next band. These are called Z-discs. These are also proteins. And so by definition, a sarcomere goes from this Z-disc all the way down to the next Z-disc. Or in the diagram, you see where the I is. We'll talk about that, the I band. It goes from one I band to the next I band. Well, inside of that sarcomere, you've got where these myofilaments all come together. And so you can see here the actin myofilaments, really they form a double helix, kind of like your DNA does. So it's a double helix. It's two thin strands of protein fibers that are intertwined. The second type of myofilament that you're going to find in muscle fibers is called myosin. And myosin does a couple of things. One is it binds to the active sites on the actin molecules. And so again, if you look at the sarcomere diagram here, you've got the actin myofilaments that's in the double helix. Then you have the myosin that runs along the length here. And you've got the head portion of the myosin. It kind of looks like a little golf club. The head portion here that binds to the actin myofilaments, and it's binding to those individual little subunits that are there, and it forms a cross bridge or a connection between this myosin head region and the actin myofilament. Now, the second thing that it does is that little golf club head region is really a hinge. It's a hinge region that has ability to kind of hinge in and out, kind of like your elbow joint. It kind of hinges in and out, and when it does, it helps to form the contraction. It helps to pull those myofilaments together to shorten the muscle sarcomere, and by shortening all the sarcomeres, you contract the muscle. Now, we looked at actin already, but there's two other proteins we need to look at associated with the actin. One of them is called tropomyosin. Tropomyosin is a very long, elongated type protein that's kind of wound around the groove of that double helix. Remember, the actin is two layers of proteins, or two filaments of proteins that are wrapped around like a double helix. Well, you've got elongated tropomyosin protein that kind of follows that groove area, so that's another protein. You also have a second protein called troponin. Troponin is a smaller protein, and it serves as a binding site on the molecules here of the actin myofilaments. So you got the actin here, it's a double helix. On each one of these little molecules here, the F-actin molecules, you have a binding site there. You have a binding site, and you'll have attached, in this particular diagram, they kind of show a little red area here. This attaches, this is a troponin. It attaches in three main places. It attaches to the actin, it attaches to the tropomyosin that goes along the actin molecule, and also attaches, can attach to calcium ions. And that comes into play when we kind of put all of these things together. Now, just a few other terms associated with a sarcomere. Again, it goes from band to band, so it starts at one Z disc and goes to the next. A Z disc is another type of protein that you find in a sarcomere. It's a vertical type or perpendicular to the main myofilament, so it's going up and down here, and it's kind of stabilizing the whole sarcomere. It's kind of, it's making this more, it's connecting site for the actin, and it's kind of stabilizing the sarcomere here. The M line, what they do is they kind of name all these different zone areas. And so the M line is, again, another protein. Again, it's kind of stabilizing the myosin. So you've got a protein called the Z disc. It's kind of stabilizing the actin. You got a protein here in what's called the H zone that is trying to stabilize and holding in place the myosin. And so kind of define each of these zones or bands is what they called. An I band is from the Z disc over to the myosin head. And so if you go Z disc over to the myosin head, either direction, that's considered to be the I band. Whenever you see the term A band, it's talking about the entire length of the myosin. So it's from head to head. However long the myosin is, that's what's called the A band. The H zone is this zone area where the actin and the myosin do not overlap. You just have myosin here in the H zone. And then one more protein that you'll have is called a Titin filament. This is an elastic type of a protein, and this, you need some elasticity. Remember, one of the functions for muscles is to stretch. That's extensibility, and then to recoil or go back into shape, that's elasticity. And so having this Titin filament in place. You can kind of see it's connected to the Z disc. This is the coiled up Titin filament. It's at the Z disc. It's coiled up. It runs the length of the myosin all the way back down to the other Z disc. So it runs the entire length of the sarcomere, and its coiled nature makes it elastic. So it allows the sarcomere to stretch. It allows your muscles to stretch and then recoil. Now, if we put all of these types of terminologies together and all these different proteins together, researchers and scientists have come up with what's called the sliding filament model that tries to explain how your sarcomeres are shortening, and that's creating a muscle contraction. And so the sliding filament model defines a muscle contraction as when the actin myofilaments, they slide over the myosin myofilaments, and that actually shortens the sarcomere. And it's important to note that the proteins really aren't changing shape. The actin and the myosin, they're not changing shape, they're not changing length, they're just kind of moving closer together, and that makes the A band get smaller. So they all kind of shorten together, and so you have the same length of the actin and myosin, it just shortens the sarcomere. Now, during relaxation, everything has to reverse. The sarcomeres lengthen out. It says here because of some external force, and so in other words, another muscle is pulling in the opposite direction. And so your muscles have an antagonistic type movement. So for example, when you contract your biceps, your arm, comes up, and then whenever you extend your arm, you have to contract your tricep muscle, and so those are antagonistic muscles.